In class, we've talked about how the premise of business economics is for firms to make money, to make as much money as possible. It's in their best interest to generate as much money as possible from the sale of their goods in order to potentially reinvest that money or to spread that money across its shareholders. We've thought about the money that can be accumulated in a couple of different ways. We've talked about them generally speaking as profit as well as revenue. Today, we're going to focus in on revenue. Until this point in theory of the firm, also known as business economics, we've talked about the amount of product that firms can create out of different resources, both variable and fixed. We've talked about the short run and the long run being where all of our inputs become variable. And we've talked about our cost structure such that when firms produce more output, they generally see a rise in their total costs. Today with revenues, we're going to see how revenues is the accumulation of money that a firm receives for selling a good, or the payments firms receive when they sell goods and services that they produce over a particular span of time. This is a pretty basic calculation where we take our total revenue, or we take our price times our quantity equal to our total revenue. We've seen this before when we've looked at our micro diagrams where price represents the vertical axis and quantity represents the horizontal axis. We can see that in this particular diagram where we have an equilibrium price and quantity, the square of our equilibrium price down to that equilibrium quantity gives us the total area of revenue that'll be produced in this market, or if this were one firm, the firm as the market, the revenue that a firm can derive from the sale of its goods. Just as with our production curves and our cost of production firms, when it comes to our calculations, we can drill down a little bit further. We can go down to the marginal level, which is our additional revenue that arises from the sale of one additional unit of output. This is our marginal revenue curve here, equal to our change in total revenue over our change in quantity. We could also calculate our average revenue equal to our total revenue divided by the total output that we are producing. When it comes to average revenue, there's a little bit of a quirk, and that's that our average revenue is always going to be equal to our price. And we can say this is true because without any form of price discrimination, in other words, if the producer is selling the product for the same price to all of its consumers, then the average revenue times the quantity is equal to our total revenue, which is the same thing as saying that our average revenue is always the price. Our revenue curves can be drawn in two contexts. The first context is one of perfect competition. This simply means that there's many firms all selling the same identical product at the same price as each other. So there's lots of competition within this marketplace. And when this competition exists, a single producer represents a very small fraction of the overall marketplace. So this firm will essentially just charge the one price, and they should, therefore, when selling higher quantities, always have increasing revenues. And that is what we see in this diagram, where we have a linear total revenue curve that is increasing at the same amount for each additional unit of output that's sold. We can see that the two axes are represented as TR for total revenue and Q for quantity. We could also call it output. Now, one reason why we might associate it more with Q for quantity than calling it output is because we're starting to verge now towards the traditional micro diagrams that we've had before. In this case, revenue is derived from a quantity that is sold within the marketplace. If we were talking about output, they might be producing the product but not necessarily selling it. So by saying Q, we can say that they're actually selling increasing quantities, and therefore that is what's increasing their total revenue. In this next diagram, we can see the marginal revenue and the average revenue. What is important to understand about the marginal revenue and the average revenue in perfect competition is that they are going to be constant. So the marginal revenue will be the same for each additional unit of quantity that's sold to the marketplace. This is true because, as we've established, within perfect competition, the price is going to be unchanged. There's no price-making power for producers in perfect competition Rather, they're all considered to be price takers. We can see this briefly here with these two diagrams, and we'll explore this a little bit further in our next chapter. The equilibrium price is given by our equilibrium in our market system. And there's many producers, let's say, that make up this market system, which represents perfect competition. So as we come across from this equilibrium, and we're given this price, which is essentially the lowest price that can be charged for these businesses to still make enough revenue to cover their costs. As we come over, we can see that for the individual firm, they essentially have a perfectly elastic demand curve. This means that if they were to change their price to, let's say, a higher price, then no consumers are going to buy their product. And so they must charge the market price that is given to them. And that price is constant here, where we have marginal revenue is equal to our demand, which is equal to our average revenue, which is going to be equal to our price. Now, as I said, we'll explore this idea a little bit further in a future video. The second scenario we'll explore with revenue curves are our alternative market structures. Now, these are any market structure where it is not perfect competition. In other words, within an alternative market structure, whether that's monopoly, oligopoly, or monopolistic competition, the individual firm has some ability to set price. They become a price maker. This has to do with the firm's ability to sell increasing amounts of quantity within the market system and represent a greater share of the market's output. So as they increase the amount of quantity that they're selling, they have to induce those sales somehow amongst their customers. If they want to induce these sales, they'll have to incentivize customers with lower prices. And here we see they could choose a higher price where they sell less output, but if they want to sell greater and greater shares of output to that market, they'll have to lower their price. Notice how this firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. This firm is representing an ever greater share of the actual marketplace. It's beginning to have essentially a demand curve representative of a market system where it's downward sloping. That is, that we have to lower the price if we want to increase the quantities that are going to be demanded from this company that's producing. We can see with our total revenue curve is going to be increasing, 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 and eventually total revenue is going to fall off at very high quantities. This is because a firm typically doesn't just lower the price of the next unit sold. If it lowers the price of the next unit, generally it's going to have to lower the price of all units in order to not discriminate against its customers. So if it's lowering the price of all of the units that it sells, eventually that it stands to reason that selling more might actually be worse off, such that there's lower revenue. This is the idea that there's a sacrifice of marginal revenue in order to sell more units. We can see the marginal revenue here. One thing to note is that as the marginal revenue curve actually becomes negative, where the next unit of marginal revenue is a negative number, it should be hurting the firm. That's where total revenue actually becomes negative. So it lines up. One last point that's a bit complex and mathematical in its nature, but that really you just have to memorize because you could be challenged on it in a paper 3 assessment, is that our slope for our marginal revenue curve is 2 times, or it's steeper than the slope of the average revenue curve. It's falling at a greater rate than the price is falling off. And that's again because the firm is going to have to reduce the price of all units that it's selling and not just the next unit that it sells. So these are the two revenue curves that we'll end up seeing. The revenue curve that is given to us in perfect competition, and the revenue curve that is experienced in an alternative market structure where there's some amount of market power. Now that we have understanding of both revenues and costs, and we can calculate them and diagram them, we'll be able to explore profit in more depth. So the next video will be the final video for this chapter, which covers the concept of profit.